Welcome to Module 6, the final two phases of the ADM. We've envisioned, designed, and planned the architecture. Now Phase G makes sure it actually gets built the way we intended, and Phase H keeps it healthy and relevant once it's live. These two phases are about realization and renewal, governing the build, then governing the change. Two ideas dominate the exam here: the architecture contract in Phase G, and the three types of architecture change in Phase H. Let's master both. Here's what you'll walk away with. You'll state the objectives of phases G and H. You'll explain the architecture contract and its central role in governance. You'll describe how architecture compliance assessments work. You'll list the three drivers for change and the three types of architecture change. And you'll understand how a change in Phase H can trigger a brand new ADM cycle. The two headline exam points to keep front of mind are the architecture contract, which belongs to Phase G, and the three change types, which belong to Phase H. Let's place these phases. After Phase F hands over a finalized plan, the architecture gets built and then maintained. Phase G, implementation governance, governs the delivery so that what's built genuinely conforms to the architecture. Phase H, architecture change management, then keeps the architecture relevant over time and decides when it's time to start a fresh cycle. And crucially, Phase H feeds back to Phase A, or even the preliminary phase, when a new cycle is warranted. The clean mental split: Phase G governs building it, Phase H governs changing it after it's live. Let's start with Phase G, implementation governance, and its objectives. First, ensure conformance with the target architecture by the implementation projects. In other words, make sure the teams build what was actually designed. Second, perform the appropriate architecture governance functions for the solution and for any change requests that arise during implementation. And third, provide architectural oversight and active support to the delivery teams. So the essence of Phase G is architectural oversight of implementation, keeping a watchful, helpful eye on the build to ensure it matches the architecture. The central instrument of Phase G is the architecture contract. An architecture contract is a joint, signed agreement between the development partners and the sponsors, covering the deliverables, the quality, and the fitness for purpose of an architecture. It's signed here, in Phase G, and it governs the implementation work that follows. Why does it matter so much? Because it turns "please follow the architecture" into something governed, monitored, and genuinely enforceable. Without a contract, conformance is just a hope. With one, it's an obligation. For the exam, lock this in: the signed architecture contract is the key Phase G deliverable, and its job is to govern implementation. There are actually two kinds of architecture contract, and the exam may test that you know both. The first is the architecture design and development contract, that's between the architecture function and the development partners who are building the solution. The second is the business user's architecture contract, that's between the architecture function and the business users who will operate the solution once it's delivered. Both serve the same underlying goal: ensuring ongoing conformance to the architecture and the realization of the intended value. So remember, two architecture contract types, one for the developers, one for the business users. Phase G relies heavily on architecture compliance assessments, formal checks that projects are adhering to the architecture. Compliance isn't simply yes or no, it's a spectrum. A project can be irrelevant to the architecture, consistent with it, compliant, conformant, fully conformant, or non-conformant, each a defined degree of alignment. And when something is non-compliant but there's a good business reason, the governance body can grant a dispensation, a controlled, time-limited exception with valid rationale. So two exam points here: compliance is a spectrum of degrees, not a binary, and dispensations are the mechanism for allowing controlled exceptions. What does the architecture team actually do in Phase G? They confirm the scope and priorities for deployment with development management. They provide hands-on guidance to the implementation projects and perform compliance reviews along the way. They support the implementation of the business and IT operations that realize the architecture. And they document lessons learned and any change requests that surface during delivery. The point worth stressing is that Phase G is not just a paperwork gate at the end, it's active, hands-on support combined with compliance checking, running alongside the delivery work. Let's gather Phase G's outputs. The headline is the signed architecture contract. Then there are the compliance assessments that record how well projects conform. There are change requests, driven by what's learned during implementation. There's the implementation governance model, describing how governance operates for this delivery. And, as always, updates flow into the architecture repository. If you remember just two, make them the signed architecture contract and the compliance assessments. Those are the outputs the exam is most likely to ask about. Now Phase H, Architecture Change Management. Its objectives are to ensure the architecture continues to achieve its original target business value, to maintain the architecture lifecycle and execute the governance framework, and to operate a change management process for the deployed architecture. Notice the emphasis on value. Phase H isn't merely about keeping the lights on or patching things, it's about making sure the architecture keeps delivering the business value it was built for. So frame it this way: Phase H keeps the architecture fit for purpose over time. It's about sustained value, not just maintenance. Phase H is fundamentally a monitoring phase. It continually watches for new technology developments, changes in the business environment, incoming governance requests, and capacity and usage trends. In fact, the standard makes a striking point: usage of the architecture is the most important part of the whole development cycle, so monitoring business growth and decline really matters. And there's a lovely piece of jargon to know: Phase H must avoid creeping elegance. That's the temptation to keep gold-plating the architecture for its own sake. Every change must be justified by genuine business value, not by an architect's desire for tidiness. The standard identifies three ways the existing infrastructure changes, three drivers that have to be integrated. First, strategic, top-down directed change, aimed at creating new capability. Think of this as capital investment driven by strategy. Second, bottom-up changes to correct or enhance existing capability. That's the operations and maintenance world, fixing and improving what's already running. And third, experiences with previously delivered project increments that are now in the care of operations but still being built out. So the three drivers are top-down strategic, bottom-up corrective, and operational experience. Hold those three in mind as a set. Now the single most testable topic in this module: the three types of architecture change. A simplification change is the smallest. It can normally be handled through routine change management techniques, and it's typically driven by a desire to reduce investment. An incremental change is in the middle. It may be handled by change management, or it may require partial re-architecting, and it's driven by a desire to derive additional value from existing investment. And a re-architecting change is the largest. It requires putting the whole architecture through the ADM again, because the architecture no longer fits and value must be substantially increased. As the tiers on screen show, they ascend by impact. Remember, simplification is smallest, re-architecting means a full new ADM cycle. The defining judgment of Phase H is this: when a change request arrives, the governance body has to decide whether it warrants just an architecture update appropriate for a simplification, or a minor incremental change, or a whole new cycle of the ADM appropriate for a re-architecting or a major incremental change. And when a new cycle is needed, it's triggered by issuing a fresh request for architecture work. So the core decision to remember for Phase H is exactly this binary: update the architecture in place, or rerun the ADM. The governance body sets the criteria for which path a given change takes. Let's make the feedback loop explicit, because it's what makes the ADM a genuine cycle rather than a one-way street. When a change in Phase H is significant enough, Phase H issues a request for architecture work, and that document starts a brand new cycle at Phase A. That's the loop that closes the circle and keeps the whole method continuous and alive. Meanwhile, the lessons learned and compliance findings from this round feed into the architecture repository, enriching the assets available next time. So commit this chain to memory: Phase H produces a request for architecture work, which kicks off Phase A. That's how the ADM loops. Phase H's outputs include architecture updates and new change requests for the smaller changes handled in place. For the bigger ones, it produces a request for architecture work to start a new cycle. It may update the statement of architecture work and the architecture contract. And it generates further compliance assessments and updates to the architecture repository. The one output to single out, because it's the one that restarts the entire method, is the request for architecture work. If a question asks which phase H output begins a new ADM cycle, that's your answer. Let's set phases G and H side by side, because keeping them distinct is worth easy marks. Phase G focuses on implementation governance, phase H on architecture change management. Phase G happens during the build and delivery, phase H happens after deployment, on an ongoing basis. Phase G's key tool is the signed architecture contract, phase H's key tool is the change management process. And the question each asks is different. Phase G asks, is it being built to the architecture? Phase H asks, should the architecture itself change, and if so, how? In a phrase, G governs building, H governs evolving. Don't swap them. A subtle point the exam likes to probe: governance is not confined to phase G. Architecture governance actually runs across all phases of the ADM. It's a continuous discipline, not a single step. What's special about phase G is that it's specifically the governance of implementation. The broader governance machinery, the architecture board, the architecture contracts, the compliance reviews underpins every phase, and we'll cover all of that properly in Module 12. So hold both truths together. Governance is continuous across the ADM, and phase G is the implementation governance phase in particular. The two statements don't conflict. Let's defuse this module's traps. 1. Phase H builds the solution. No, building and oversight are phase G, H manages change afterward. 2. The architecture contract is signed in phase A. No, it's signed in phase G. 3. Every change triggers a new ADM cycle. No, only re-architecting or major changes do, smaller ones are handled as updates. And 4. There are two types of architecture change. No, there are three: simplification, incremental, and re-architecting. The two things to overlearn here are the three change types and the update versus new cycle decision. Get those solid, and phase H holds no surprises. Your G&H cheat sheet. Phase G is implementation governance, phase H is architecture change management. Phase G's key deliverable is the signed architecture contract. There are two architecture contract types: design and development, and business users. There are three drivers for change: strategic top-down, bottom-up corrective, and operational experience. There are three types of architecture change: simplification, incremental, and re-architecting. The smallest change is simplification, the one requiring a full new ADM cycle is re-architecting. And the loopback output is the request for architecture work. Screenshot it. Let's recap. Phase G governs implementation so it conforms to the architecture, using the signed architecture contract and compliance assessments. Phase H keeps the architecture delivering business value, continually monitoring for change and guarding against creeping elegance. There are three drivers for change and three types of change: simplification, incremental, and re-architecting. And phase H makes the central decision of update versus new ADM cycle, with a new cycle starting via a request for architecture work. With that, you've completed all 9 ADM activities, a genuine milestone in your preparation. Let's celebrate covering the whole method with a one-line recap of every phase. Preliminary, prepare. A. Vision. B. Business. C. Data and application. D. Technology. E. Solutions and transitions. F. Migration plan. G. Govern the build. H. Manage change. And at the center, continuously, requirements management. That's the entire ADM in a breath. From here, the rest of the course covers the supporting concepts that make the ADM work: the continuum, the content framework, governance, and the reference models. But the spine, the ADM itself, you now know end to end. There's one activity that has been quietly present at the center of everything we've covered: requirements management. We've mentioned it again and again, always sitting in the middle of the wheel, but it deserves a focused treatment of its own. It runs continuously, feeding requirements into every phase and drawing them back out as things change. Module 7 gives it the dedicated attention. The one idea to carry forward: requirements management is not a phase you start and finish, it's the hub that connects all the others. Let's go look at it properly. A quick self-check before the questions. From memory, can you name the 2 architecture contract types? Can you list the 3 types of architecture change and say which one triggers a full ADM cycle? Can you state the one core difference between phase G and phase H? And can you name the output that restarts the ADM? If any of those came out hesitant, jump back to slide 5 for the contract, slide 13 for the change types, and slide 17 for the G versus H distinction. A minute of review now saves marks later. Let's step back and see why these 2 phases matter so much. Without phase G, implementation projects gradually drift away from the architecture, and the value you carefully designed in leaks away unnoticed. Without phase H, the architecture slowly decays, it keeps describing the organization of yesterday while the business of today moves on. Together, G and H make the architecture both realized and durable, built faithfully, and kept relevant. So the contextual takeaway is this: G ensures conformance during delivery, and H ensures continued relevance and value over time. Both are essential to real impact. Now that we've covered all 9 ADM activities, the course pivots to the frameworks that support the ADM. Module 7 gives requirements management its proper focus. Module 8 covers the enterprise continuum and the architecture repository. And modules 9 through 13 cover the content framework, architecture governance, partitioning, stakeholders, and the reference models. Think of it this way: the ADM is the spine of TOGAF, and these remaining modules are the supporting skeleton around it. Each one deepens your command of the framework and shores up another slice of the exam. Onward to requirements management. Question 1. In which phase is the architecture contract signed, and what is its purpose? Pause to consider your answer. The correct answer is C, phase G, to govern implementation so it conforms to the architecture. The signed architecture contract is the key deliverable of phase G, implementation governance. It is a joint agreement between development partners and sponsors that governs the implementation and ensures it conforms to the target architecture. Question 2. What are the 3 types of architecture change in phase H? Pause to consider your answer. The correct answer is B, simplification, incremental, and re-architecting. The 3 types of architecture change are simplification, smallest, reduce investment, incremental, derive additional value, may need partial re-architecting, and re-architecting, largest, put the whole architecture through the ADM again. Question 3. Which type of change requires putting the whole architecture through the ADM again? Pause to consider your answer. The correct answer is C, re-architecting change. A re-architecting change is significant enough that it requires running the entire architecture through the ADM again. A simplification change is handled by change management, an incremental change may need only partial re-architecting. Question 4. What is the primary difference between phase G and phase H? Pause to consider your answer. The correct answer is B, phase G governs the implementation during delivery, phase H manages change to the architecture after deployment. Phase G, implementation governance, governs the build/delivery so it conforms to the architecture, via the architecture contract. Phase H, architecture change management, manages change to the architecture after it is deployed, deciding whether changes warrant an update or a new ADM cycle. Question 5. When phase H determines that a significant change is needed, how is a new ADM cycle initiated? Pause to consider your answer. The correct answer is B. By issuing a request for architecture work that starts a new cycle at phase A. A significant change in phase H is handled by issuing a new request for architecture work, which starts a new cycle at phase A. This feedback loop is what makes the ADM continuous. Dispensations handle controlled non-compliance, not new cycles.